Hello, my friends. Welcome to another special Global Pop episode of 30 Albums for 30 Years. I am your host, Jay Sweet. Today, we will be discovering Latin jazz, and we began our program with a piece by Tito Puente called El Mambo Diablo. Tito Puente, if you listen to my episode on the music of Latin America, was heavily featured, and he's often referred to as the king of Latin jazz. Tito Puente was a highly accomplished percussionist, composer, and bandleader whose career spanned over 5 decades, and he has played a significant role in popularizing Latin jazz music worldwide. So what is Latin jazz? Well, it's simple, really. Latin jazz combines traditional and popular Latin music with American jazz music. An early pre-jazz bandleader and composer, W.C. Handy, began incorporating Latin rhythms into his music early on. For example, his recording and his hit, St. Louis Blues from 1914, has a Latin bass line. And then we have Jelly Roll Morton, the great Dixieland innovator from New Orleans. He also used Latin rhythms in his music, which he called a Spanish tinge. This can be heard in his recording of New Orleans Blues and many other Jelly Roll Morton compositions. And then we take Duke Ellington, who began experimenting with Latin forms as well, particularly when the swing big band leader hired Puerto Rican valve trombonist and composer Juan Tizol. Tizol's influence can be heard on the 1936 classic Caravan. You should check those pieces out: St. Louis Blues, New Orleans Blues, and Caravan. Machito, whose real name was Francisco Raúl Gutierrez Grillo, was a renowned bandleader and percussionist who was critical in popularizing and shaping the sounds of Afro-Cuban jazz. He was born on February 16, 1908 in Havana, Cuba. In 1937, he immigrated from Cuba to the United States and formed the Afro-Cubans, a group with trumpeter Mario Bauza serving as his musical director in the early 1940s. The band combined Cuban rhythms with jazz harmonies, including Afro-Cuban percussion and traditional jazz instrumentation. Machito's Afro-Cubans collaborated with several jazz legends, including Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, and Machito recorded in 1947 with jazz bandleader Stan Kenton, playing maracas on a tune known as The Peanut Vendor. The Peanut Vendor is a great recording and a hit for Kenton's orchestra. He also played a historic concert at Carnegie Hall on February 11, 1949, on a bill which included Duke Ellington, Lester Young, Bud Powell, and Coleman Hawkins, all jazz legends. Machito was truly a pioneer of Latin jazz music and deserves more notoriety. The song Tanga, T-A-N-G-A, was recorded by Machito and his Afro-Cubans band in 1942, and it is considered the first jazz recording to incorporate a clave pattern. So let's talk about the clave for a moment. The clave is a rhythmic pattern used as a tool for tempo organization in Cuban music and other Latin forms. It is often played on a set of wood blocks called claves. So essentially, the clave pattern holds an entire piece together, and it changes based on the many subgenres of Latin music. Check it out. Tanga. Dizzy Gillespie was a legendary jazz trumpeter who helped create a more harmonically and melodically advanced form of jazz called bebop, along with alto saxophonist Charlie Parker. Bebop was a break from the more commercialized music of later swing, kind of emerged in the early to mid 1940s. Then Parker and Gillespie break up their band. Parker had some serious drug and mental issues at the time, and Gillespie went on to form a big band in 1946. And in 1947, Gillespie met Latin jazz trumpeter legendary Mario Bauza and became interested in Afro-Cuban music. He then hired Cuban percussionist Chano Pozo and began blending Latin elements into his band, thus pioneering a style known as cubop. Pozo played in Gillespie's orchestra. Now, his collaboration with Pozo was sadly shortly lived because Pozo was murdered in 1948 at the age of 33. The murder was possibly the result of a botched drug deal. But after Pozo's death, Gillespie continued incorporating Latin music into his blend of bebop, funk, and jazz for decades. Manteiga is one of the earliest tunes of Afro-Cuban jazz. It was co-written by Dizzy Gillespie, Chano Pozo, and Gil Fuller in 1947, and is among the most famous of Gillespie's recordings, along with the earlier tune A Night in Tunisia, which also showcases some Latin elements. It's really a fantastic track with some great rhythmic elements. Enjoy Manteiga. Chucho Valdés is a Cuban pianist and composer who is celebrated for his virtuosic performances and innovative compositions that fuse jazz with Afro-Cuban elements. He has been a leading figure in Latin jazz for decades. Valdés was born in Cuba in 1941 and began recording as a leader in 1964. In 1967, he started the celebrated group Orquesta Cubana de Música Moderna, an all-star Latin jazz big band. Valdés has won 7 Grammy Awards and 5 Latin Grammys. Mambo Influenciado is a jazz-infused piece that showcases Chucho Valdés's virtuosity as a pianist and his ability to blend traditional Afro-Cuban rhythms with modern jazz elements. The composition has become a standard in the Afro-Cuban jazz repertoire and is considered a signature piece for Chucho Valdés. Cal Tjader, that's T-J-A-D-E-R, is a vibraphonist and percussionist born in California who played a significant role in integrating Latin rhythm and jazz during the 1950s and 1960s. His music often blended elements of jazz, Latin music, and Brazilian music. But he began his career as a boy wonder, a tap dancing boy wonder, in fact, as part of an act that included his father, who was a dancer, and his mother, who was a pianist. In 1943, Tjader joined the Navy and saw action in 5 invasions. He then returned, attended San Jose State College and then San Francisco College. He played drums with pianist Dave Brubeck and became an integral part of the California jazz music scene. He then worked with piano legend George Shearing, and then in 1954, he formed his group, the Cal Tjader Modern Mambo Quintet. And his group became associated with the mambo craze of the late 1950s. While on tour in Manila in 1982, Tjader collapsed and died from a heart attack. He was 56 years old. The song Afro Blue comes from percussionist Mongo Santa Maria, who recorded his composition in 1959 when working with the Cal Tjader Sextet. Afro Blue was the first jazz standard built on a typical African 3-2 cross-rhythmic pattern, or what's known as a hemiola. A lot of fancy words to mean it's got a very specific rhythmic pattern. This version comes from the 1960s album Cal Tjader, featuring Mongo Santa Maria, Latino. Take notice of Al McKibben's bass line. He also worked with Dizzy Gillespie, Paul Horn on the flute, and Willie Bobo on timbales. There's also another fantastic version of the song that's quite different from John Coltrane in 1963, but that's for another program. So check it out, Cal Tjader and Mongo Santa Maria, Afro Blue. Eddie Palmieri is a renowned pianist, bandleader, and composer who is known for his groundbreaking work in Latin jazz and salsa music. Palmieri who is of Puerto Rican heritage, was born and raised in Spanish Harlem in the Bronx section of New York. In the 1950s, he played with various Latin groups. In 1961, he founded the group Conjunto La Perfecta. With that group, he departed from the traditional Cuban sources of salsa instrumentation by introducing new stylistic devices, more jazz-related instrumentation, into the New York Latin jazz scene. Their signature sound relied heavily on two trombones and a flute instead of trumpets. Palmieri, who is now 86 years old, began recording in 1962 and has had a long, storied career. Azucar, which means sugar, is one of Eddie Palmieri's most famous and influential compositions. It comes from his 1965 album, Azucar Pa Ti. This album is considered a classic in the Latin jazz genre and has had a long-lasting impact on the world of salsa music. Palmieri plays a great extended piano solo on this one. It's just a great jam. Check it out, Azucar, Sugar. Ray Barretto was an American percussionist of Puerto Rican descent, born in New York City. He became highly influenced by the music of Dizzy Gillespie, and after serving in the military from 1946 through 1949, he began attending jam sessions and perfected his conga playing. In the mid-1950s, he recorded with and worked alongside Tito Puente, and by the 1960s, he was a house musician for Prestige, Blue Note, and Riverside Records. He was just appearing on a lot of albums. In 1962, he formed Chirenga La Moderna and recorded the hit El Watusi. His recording credits as a sideman and leader are numerous and impactful. Barretto remained active till his death in 2006. El Watusi is a famous Latin dance track by Ray Barretto. The song was released in 1963 and became a significant hit during the Boogaloo and Latin Soul era. El Watusi is characterized by its infectious rhythm, it's got a catchy melody, and a very danceable groove, and it played a critical role in introducing Latin music to a wider audience. It was part of a fusion of Latin rhythms with that blend of soul and R&B that really made the song a hit. And its popularity led to a dance style known as the Watusi, which became a cultural phenomenon, especially in the 1960s. El Watusi. Paquito de Rivera is a gifted Cuban saxophonist and clarinetist born in Havana, Cuba. He began studying saxophone at the age of 5 and attended the Havana Conservatory of Music, and then went on to work with the Cuban National Symphony Orchestra and performed regularly with Chucho Valdés as a founding member of Orquesta Cubana de Música Moderna. He then presented the group Iri Kerry, which blended jazz, classical, and Cuban music. It's kind of a fusion group. De Rivera defected from Cuba in the early 1980s and worked regularly in the States, and at 75 years young, he is still actively making quality music. He's really a virtuoso, Paquito de Rivera. On Green Dolphin Street is a 1947 popular song composed for the film Green Dolphin Street, which was based on the 1944 novel of the same name. The song became a jazz standard in the 1950s. While most versions shift between Latin and swing feels, De Rivera's version keeps the Latin rhythm throughout. His playing is incredible on the track, and it comes from his 1981 record, Paquito Blowing, from Columbia Records, on Green Dolphin Street. Arturo Sandoval is another incredibly gifted Cuban musician. He's a trumpeter and pianist who received formal training at the Cuban National School of Arts after performing regularly as a teen. He helped establish the Orquesta Cubana de Música Moderna, which became the band Iri Kerry, which of course included Paquito de Rivera. In 1973, he toured worldwide with that group. During the following year, he toured with Dizzy Gillespie, who became his friend and mentor. Simply put, Sandoval is a masterful legend and one of the greatest trumpeters of the second half of the 20th century and beyond. One of Pablo Sandoval's most famous compositions is A Mis Abuelos, which means my grandparents. This version comes from his 1994 record, Danzon. The piece showcases his exceptional skills as a trumpeter and incorporates elements of Afro-Cuban jazz. Now, the track opens with some great Spanish guitar playing by René Luis Toledo, followed by a slow trumpet solo. The piece really kicks in at around 1 minute and 45 seconds with heavy orchestration. Pablo Sandoval is known for his high-note trumpet playing and a purity of tone. He has an incredible range on the trumpet. His technical prowess is on full display on this track. Take notice of the clapping rhythms, and as he often does, Sandoval ends on an incredible high note. A mis abuelos, my grandparents. Pablo Sandoval, check it out. All right, my friends, there we have it, an overview of the music of Latin jazz and some of the significant artists who have contributed to that genre. Of course, I've only just scratched the surface. There are a lot of other great Latin jazz artists and songs that you should check out on your own. To learn more about the podcast, you can go to 30albumsfor30years.com and check me out on social media. I also have a book, A History of American Music, 1750 through 1950, an origin story. That's available on Kendall Hunt Publishing. So you can check that out as well. So together, let's keep this music alive. Have a wonderful day. Peace.